Okay, you can see where they welded the fuel tanks together. You can also see the walk-through, get from one side of the engine to the other. The box is a sandbox right there. The other sandboxes are either on the other side or up in the nose. You'll see the sand filler hatches on the nose. Radiators, and then the vents with on the flared part that have the flat fins. That was your dynamic brake resistor grids. Immediately this side of the dynamic brake, see that access hatch? That means the engine was equipped with extended range dynamic braking. Let me explain. The locomotive has, in this case, two V16s. It's like two engines on a common underframe. Look at the thickness of the underframe on this engine and compare it to the underframe on the SD40 tunnel motor, the SD45, etc. It's much thicker. It transmitted a lot more weight, and actually as they got older they developed a very faint but discernible sag in some of them from millions of miles of operations.
Well, that's a long wheelbase.
It is. Anyway, the V16 motors run a big main generator. It generates 600 volts of electricity, which is fed by cables to electric traction motors geared to and mounted atop each axle on each wheel set, called a truck. Okay, diesel electric. There's no connection between the V16 crankshaft and the wheels. A lot of people, you need to explain that to people. They think you push the gas pedal and go, like in a car or a truck. It's not like that. It's an electric locomotive that generates its own electricity without wires. That's why diesels have been so successful and so flexible. You don't have to spend $5 million a mile putting up Campner, you know, and power plants and all that. Okay. You're going upgrade. You got the throttle open to notch 8. There's 8 notches on a standard locomotive throttle. Notch 8 or run 8 is like flooring it in a car. Okay, that's full power. The V16s are running about 893 RPM. That was their normal top end, about just under 900. And the generator's turning, and boy, the power's going to the traction motors. Now, what happens when you come over the top up at Evanston or Wasatch and you begin that 65 miles of descending grade down to Ogden? You don't need to give the train power. Weight's taking the train downhill. So the engineer would close the throttle to idle, and he had to count at least 10 seconds. Usually they'd be safe and do count to 15 to make sure all energy had dissipated from the main generator through all the wiring and the traction motors, and everything was out. Then he would take right below the throttle on the control stand. If we had a smaller group, I'd actually take you in the cab and show you this. There's like another throttle. It says dynamic brake. If there's one thing that helped diesels beat steam from an operational flexibility point of view in the mountainous West, it was the fact they had dynamic brakes, which was an option back in the 50s, 40s, and early 60s. By the 70s, dynamic brakes became a standard feature of engines. Because even flatland railroads like Mopac, Missouri Pacific, and Rock Island, who didn't used to buy engines with dynamic brakes, they had a newer version of it, and it became an essential train handling tool. Not just for railroads that went over the Rockies or the Sierra or the Cascades to hold the train back. So the engineer takes a dynamic brake and he pulls that throttle out like he's advancing the regular throttle, and it says, oh, there's a little window that tells him where he is. The throttle has that too. It says idle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Dynamic brake is set up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So he sets it up. That energizes the dynamic brake system. Then he starts notching it out, and you know what the most important gauge on a diesel locomotive is? What is it?
Air pressure.
The amp meter, that's right. The weak link of diesel engines is the electrical system. It'll go south on you long before your V16 will or anything else. Your electricals have a limit to how much energy they can handle over given periods of time. On forward throttle operations, your throttle on these, the amp meter would go up to about 1,000 amps, and that was the green zone. Then you'd get a red zone. And it had there's a little thing on the amp meter that says 60, 30, 15, and 5. That's minutes. You can take it above 1,000 amps or 1,050 amps or whatever the top end was, a little bit over for an hour and not burn up your electrical system. Or you can put it all the way over, but you better only do it for a couple of minutes, because after 5 minutes you're going to melt down your traction motors, okay? You have to watch that. Well, dynamic brake works the same way as the throttle, but what you're doing is you have reversed the polarity of the traction motors on the axles. Okay, you take an electric motor, any kind of an electric motor, and you put a crank on it. If you feed it electricity, it'll turn like the traction motors do. But what happens if you take all the electricity away from it, then take the crank and start turning it? What does it do? It generates electricity. Railroads, General Motors in 1939, when the first freight diesel came out, road freight diesel, the FT, the streamlined engine, they realized that they could take advantage of that, and they could make the traction motors turn into generators, and it would hold the train back. It was like an electric version of a Jake brake on a truck to a certain degree. So as you come down the Wasatch or Donner Pass or Cajon Pass or whatever, you set up the dynamic brakes, and you can help hold the train back without having to use the air brakes, which press on the wheels, and if you do that too much, you've got to stop to cool the wheels. That's why Echo, being the only flat spot coming down the grade, and at the bottom of the steepest part of the Wasatch grade, was where trains would stop for 30 minutes to cool their wheels in the days of steam engines. And they get water there, they had a coaling station, fuel oil, etc. Diesels eliminated all of that. Now, the early day dynamic brakes on the old Streamliner type engines and some of the early road switchers up to 1966, they used standard dynamic brake, which was only effective down to about 15 miles an hour. If you wanted to get the train below 15, you had to use your air brake. Okay, in 1966, when General Motors introduced its 645 line of engines, its 40 line, the SD45, the original SD40s, GP40s, they offered something called extended range dynamic braking. That allowed you to take the train down to 7 or 8 miles an hour. Today's dynamic brakes on the new third generation engines will go down to about 4 or 5 miles an hour. So that hatch is how a rail fan spots if the engine had extended range dynamic braking, which was a standard. They didn't offer the old style after they came out with this because it was so great. See, below, if you can only go to 15, dynamic brakes were of not much use to a railroad like the Rock Island running from Denver to Kansas City. But if you can get a train down to 7 miles an hour on dynamic braking, all of a sudden that becomes a better way to handle the train than constantly having to use your air brakes coming up and down those hills in the Midwest, coming into a terminal, etc. That's why you don't see engines without dynamic brakes now. No one has an engine without dynamic brakes. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, which one was